Hey, Tooth and Coiners, it's the episode about partnerships. Yes, one of those pieces of business that you never really get excited to think about until it is knocking on your door. And then all of a sudden you think, hey, maybe this is the next best thing for me. Maybe there's a lot of opportunity here. Maybe I can make my life easier. Maybe I can make a little bit more money if I can just get this person to be my partner. This episode is going to talk about a lot of that. It's also going to talk about the common partnership setups, how hopefully the compensation to the different owners works, why a lot of partnerships fail, as well as why some succeed. We're also going to talk a bit about the different levels of your business's life cycle of when the partnership question typically gets asked and what I think about each of those pieces of it. So buckle up. It's going to be an interesting episode. It's one that sometimes can be a little bit controversial as well because people really like to put their foot down and say that this is the best decision for them, sometimes even when it may not be. So here we go. We're going to talk about the most common partnership setups that we typically see here at Tooth and Coin for dental practice owners going around the U.S. The first one that I'll start with is one that we don't see quite as often, but it's one that we used to see a whole lot more of when I was starting out in CPA practice about 20 years ago. And that was whenever there would be shared overhead expenses between two dentists that would maybe not necessarily be partners. So they would have Dr. A's PLLC, Dr. B's PLLC, and they would be dental practices operating in one space that has operatories, and they'd have their own assistants. They'd probably have their own hygienist, but they would have front office people, and they'd have computers, and they'd have rent, and they'd have utilities, and all the things that go along with that. And they'd also have like their own equipment and everything like that. But, you know, Dr. A PLLC and Dr. B PLLC would have what were their own personal expenses, and then they'd have shared expenses. Generally, the personal expenses would be any staff that is specifically their staff, so hygienist or assistants, as well as supplies related to their services, any equipment that is for them specifically in their operatories that were deemed to be their operatories, and any labs that were coming out for their cases for their patients. That was generally the expenses that went into their bucket. So PLC A's bucket, as well as PLLC B's bucket. And then they would have shared expenses, which would be like the front office people. It would be the rent and utilities and office expenses and just general information about things like that. Sometimes they'd have like advertising expenses and things like that that go in there. They'd be usually relatively small. And all those would go into the mixed bucket. So they'd be A plus B bucket. And that bucket would then get split evenly between those two dentists. They'd have some type of an agreement where they would just share those overhead expenses. And that worked. That was actually a really common setup in dental practices as well as many other types of medical practices throughout the 70s and 80s and 90s. I don't see it as much today, and I don't really know why that is. It does seem to work fairly well. There are complications with it, just like with every type of partnership, and I'll get into that in the why partnerships fail setup, but it was a fairly common setup for a while, and some people, they would be in that setup, and whenever they were done, they would sell it to somebody else. Somebody else would come in and take Dentist A PLLC's setup over, and they would just keep going on. We do not see that as often now. I think out of our 400 offices, we have like one practice that does that. So it's fairly rare now. The second, which is the most common setup that we see nowadays, is a partnership that has two dentists in it. Dentist A and Dentist B, they are full partners, and they just run a partnership. And they have a dental practice that operates where everything is a shared expense. Everything is paid through one entity. And those two doctors are the two owners and partners in that practice, and they are typically a 50-50 partnership. That's the most common setup because it's the simplest form of partnership. The third type of partnership is multi-partner. So when there's multiple doctors that are involved, 3, 4, 5, 10 dentists or something like that that are in a partnership, those are a little bit more rare nowadays compared to the solo doctor practice or the two doctor partnership practice. Out of 400 offices we help out with, we might have less than 1% of our clients are that setup. And it may be because we focus so much on a specific type of market in terms of our clients, but we definitely do not see very many of those setups anymore. They are there, they are out there, but they're tricky. And the reason they're tricky is that once you grow to a certain size, it becomes hard to start bringing in partners, and it's very hard in the medical service company to get to that level because it requires a lot of growth, and growth in dentistry and medical services is typically slowly incremental, if that. But if you're adding in equity partners, you're diluting the prior partners while that practice is growing. And a lot of the partners don't want that, right? They don't want their piece of the pie to shrink as they grow. So that can create some challenges as well whenever you're trying to grow to that certain size. Most of the partnerships that we see, there are these big multi-doctor, multi-practices. They are generally older practices that were that way a long time ago, and people just bought in and bought out and moved in and moved out over time. Or alternatively, they are the last type of partnership, which is like a DSO type partnership, where there's just a whole bunch of people involved. Some people own more than others. Maybe there's a management company involved. Maybe there's some type of a holding entity involved and things like that. And those obviously have their own ups and downs. They're not really the purpose of the conversation today. Is more about the more common setup, which is the 2-doctor partnership, and discussing if that's a good idea or not. So now that we've talked about the common setups, let's talk about the compensation structure of how most of these setups are. And I tell people to think of the compensation structure in 2 paths. One is production-based and one is equity-based. In other words, if you have 2 ends of a spectrum, and on one end is fully production-based, that's one version of it. And then on the other end of the spectrum is purely equity-based, and that's another possibility. There are other components you can add in there that are differentiators. For example, if you have someone who does the administrative side of the business and that's all that they do, logic carries that if you're spending your time doing the business stuff, you probably can't be producing, which means that there should be some type of a component that adds to that person's take home or compensation for doing that part of the work if it's not split evenly. So when you think of that 2-sided spectrum of being production-based or being equity-based, there are little caveats like that that can be added after that spectrum has been decided for a partnership. So in terms of that, if we have a hypothetical partnership being started, then if we say, hey, we're going to be a completely production-based partnership, you eat what you kill, this is how our setup's going to be, whoever produces more gets the more money, whatever it may be, then that is one option that partnerships go for. The other option is, hey, we're going to be 50-50 partners. If I make $1, you make $1. If you make $10, I make $10. And that's how the partnership is going to work. These are options. These are things that practices do and how partnerships are set up to this day, being one of those 2 pieces of it. However, that is not always going to be the best setup for every practice owner. I was having a conversation one time with a client at the time, and I believe it was Rob Montgomery, who's a great dental attorney, was on the call, and the person was trying to figure out the perfect partnership setup for their practice. It was like 2 dentists that were going in together on this purchase of a practice. And Rob had to finally intervene and say, hey, there's no such thing as a perfect partnership setup because partnerships change. The perfect setup today will not be the same perfect setup 3 to 5 years from now. And that's where partnerships are challenging. And I'm ad-libbing a little bit of what Rob said. He probably would say it much more eloquently and much more directly than what I said. But the gist of it is that you can't be perfect in setting up a partnership because things change. If you think of any relationship that you've ever had in your life, they change. The relationship between yourself and your parents, or relationship between yourself and your friends, or relationship between yourself and your spouse, or girlfriend, or boyfriend, or whomever it may be, all those things change. Same thing happens in business relationships. Perfect setup today may not be the perfect setup a few years from now. And so in terms of what setup is the best for each person, I tell them to think of that spectrum. Think of where they want to land in terms of that spectrum, and keeping it as simple as they can be on thinking of, okay, we're going to be some type of hybrid, right? We're not going to land on either side of the spectrum. We're going to land somewhere in the middle of where we end up. And that is the most common setup that we see nowadays. So typically the 2 doctors will have some type of guaranteed pay or compensation based off of their own personal production, be it 25, 30, 35%, whatever it is for those practice owners, whatever they feel most comfortable with. And then the remainder, it goes to the equity side of the equation. So let's say that in this hypothetical setup, we've got 30% production based and the rest profit is equity. Then if Dr. A does let's say $500,000 in production, and Dr. B does $600,000 in production. And then let's say there's $100,000 left over in profit at the end of the day. This is after they pay themselves. So Dr. A would get 30% of 500,000, which is 150,000 to take home. And Dr. B would get 30% of 600,000, which would be $180,000 to take home. And then they'd split the $100,000 of profit that was left over after they pay themselves 50-50, so 50,000 each. So Dr. A ends up with 200,000, Dr. B ends up with 230,000. And that's how a typical partnership happens every day in the dental space. Now, at some point, there are times when I said like those little caveats that get added. Let's say Dr. A, the reason he produced so much less is because he's a very highly business person. He's the one who does all the advertising, he manages all the staff, he does all the HR, he does all the hiring, he does all the training, he does all the working with the accountant, he does all the billing functions, he does all the IT stuff, he does all the computer things. There's just a bunch of things that goes into running a business, right? Maybe they run all the daily huddles, daily meetings. Maybe they're the one who does most of the disciplinarian in terms of talking to clients about different things. Maybe he does a lot of the customer service. There's just so much stuff to do when you own a business. Obviously, that's going to take away from him being able to produce, or Dr. A being able to produce. And at that point, you typically say, how much is Dr. A going to get in terms of this extra stuff outside of the production side? Because obviously his ability to produce has been hampered. And usually that comes in that example I said, Dr. A got 150, Dr. B got 180. Typically what happens is with that $100,000 that's left over, that's usually where that pay comes from. Is like, it's like that person's going to get a guaranteed $20,000 a year for handling all these things, right? Which if you think of all those things that just listed, that's probably more than $20,000 of value that person was generating or was using. If you go hire somebody to do all those things for you and do it as well as the owner would for $20,000, you do it every day. But that's an example of typically how that setup happens whenever the ownership side of things is being handled differently. And again, that's one of the reasons why there's no perfect partnership setup, because things change. Because if that practice is doing that today, what happens if they double or triple in size? The doubling and tripling the size, there's going to be a whole lot more work to do on the business side of things. So yeah, I'll get more into that, into the reasons why practices fail. I do want to cover the other pieces of the compensation structure. And that's whenever there's two dentists that are actually actively owning the practice together, working the practice and doing those things as well. I am seeing a whole lot more of there being like this silent partner in the shadows or that's helping out with things as well. And I'm not a huge fan of those because I've yet to see a whole lot of value be derived from those partnerships. I'm not saying they're not there, and I'm not saying that anyone who has this set up is taking advantage of somebody else or is being taken advantage of if they're on the other side of this. But the typical setup we see of that is that there's a doctor that's the owner, that's say like an 80% owner, up to 80% owner. Sometimes it's even the inverse. And then there's a 20% owner that's like the business partner that's the owner of that. And that business partner is the person who's responsible for all those things that I mentioned before in terms of their head of the hiring and the firing and the business setup and everything like that. As I mentioned, there's a lot of things that go on with doing all of those pieces of the puzzle. However, if there's someone that's in the office every day that's taking care of all those things, then I can get a little bit more behind that. But generally, whenever I see that set up, the premise is that person's usually not even going to be in the office ever. Maybe not even in the same state as the office. And they may be advising on those things, but they're not really doing those things, which is a very big difference, right? So being more like kind of hands off than being active ownership. And they're certainly not there making sure that the hygienist clocks out for lunch or the assistant got there on time after they got back from lunch. That setup is out there as well. I guess you can include that in the setup versions of things, but that is a very common way. And the way that those people are typically compensated is there's the production to the dentist. So let's say the same example, there's Dr. A and they did $500,000 in production. They would get the $150,000 for their production. There'd be $100,000 that's left over. Dr. A would get $80,000 because they're 80% owner. In the example I gave, the silent partner, who's a 20% owner, would just get the $20,000. So they'd just be a silent owner in that dental practice. That's typically how that goes. I will say the people that I've talked to that have considered those things, that's actually way more favorable for the dentist than what most of those setups are. A lot of those setups are much more, oh no, it's the business manager is going to make $100,000 a year or something like that, and then they're going to get their 20% or something. So it varies in terms of those pieces of it, but that is how that silent equity partner gets compensated. And then finally, there's also, if there's like some type of a management structure in place, so you can carry over to more of like a DSO type setup, or where there's like a practice or some type of an entity that's an owner in the company And then there's the partner dentist, which is also working there too. That's fairly similar to that 80-20 example I gave where there's the silent partner. And I've seen it both ways. I've seen it where the DSO is like a minority owner, and I've also seen it where they're a majority owner and the dentist is actually the minority owner. In other words, they own smaller than 50% of the entire company. And then the management company actually runs the thing, and they get somewhere between 5 and 10% of revenue that comes through the doors. And then the doctor gets paid their associate pay, which is 30% of revenue or collections for their stuff. And then they split whatever's left over at the end based off of equity. So I hope that kind of shows you the two different components that are being production-based pay and then equity-based pay. That spectrum even carries over to the DSO side of things, right? Because it's typically the same setup. And then the caveats get pulled out of profit before we get to those pieces too. Anyway, so that's generally how those things happen. So now we're going to talk about the failures and like why partnerships typically fail. I am a little bit of a scorned person in this because I actually, believe it or not, was a part of a partnership at one point in time. I started Tooth and Coin with a business partner, and that person was the salesperson and I was the operations person. They did, and they sold a lot of business. And I was really good at what I did. I was very good at getting the work done and doing the things that needed to be done there. And we had a certain setup. And as things happen, about 6 to 12 months into the partnership, things changed, which the other partner, he had some need he needed out of the business. I had needs of what I needed out of the business. And we couldn't make those two needs meet. And so we had to split. And that was fine. That was a part of it. Not a big deal at all. It happens. We were lucky because we were still young in the business's setup, as well as we didn't have a ton of overhead because we were in a CPA space rather than being in like a brick and mortar retail medical office space with a whole bunch of overhead that we had taken a whole bunch of debt on with. So for us, it was fine. And we're still friends today. But I can remember an advisor telling us there's two types of partnerships, ones that have ended and ones that are going to. And that always stuck with me because it may be a somewhat cynical view of partnerships. It is true because eventually it will end one way or the other. And so let's talk about why they fail. Partnerships typically fail because those agreements that I talked about become unfair to one party or the other, or even they're perceived to become unfair to one person or the other. So in the prior example I gave of Dr. A and Dr. B, where, when Dr. A was doing all the business stuff, at some point when the business gets so much larger and the production ability goes down for Dr. A, they're going to start getting a little bit spiteful of Dr. B's ability to produce because they're going to feel like they're doing so much of the work to generate the patient activity to get the patients into Dr. B's chair. That original amount of money they were being compensated for the business stuff isn't going to feel equivalent in terms of the amount of work that they're doing. Like, they was like, why am I only getting $20,000 a year when I'm generating an extra $300,000 a year in revenue of take home for this guy? Because he's able to do $1.8 million in revenue and he gets 30% of that. And I'm only able to do $1 million in revenue because I'm busting my butt doing all the business stuff. And so there's a huge disparity in what that Dr. B makes versus what Dr. A makes, but Dr. A feels like they're doing a lot of the work. That happens a lot where one partner in the setup feels like they're doing too much work. Now, if we change the hypothetical to say, hey, Dr. A and Dr. B, they both feel they do an equivalent amount of work on the business side of things, then all of a sudden that dynamic changes and that example is no longer as valid. Now, I'm not saying that Dr. A and Dr. B can't at some point butt heads and think that one person is doing more work than the other on the business stuff at that point. That does happen as well, but that's not typically as big of a deal. Hey, Dr. A is doing so much of it and he doesn't feel like he's being fairly compensated based off of the partnership structure. What's more common with Dr. A and Dr. B at that point, if they both evenly do the business stuff, is let's keep the setup of saying, hey, actually, Dr. B is, let's say they're doing $1.5 million a year in revenue, and Dr. A is now doing $1.2 million a year in revenue. Dr. B is doing more revenue. Dr. A is doing less revenue. At some point, egos can get to be a part of the picture. Dr. A may say, why is he doing 25% more revenue than I am? And internally, Dr. A may start thinking like, the reason he's doing that is because the front office receptionist likes him a lot more and they give him all the good new patients. Or Dr. A is the one that it seems like every time I see someone who needs ortho, I have to send them over to Dr. B because I don't do it, but I don't get paid any of that money for the referral. And there's just a whole bunch of things that start coming up that like where ego kind of gets in the way. And when I say ego, I'm not meaning that in a negative connotation, because the ego can be good as well. And it may, and somewhat should rightfully be set up that there's all these little nuances of, hey, Dr. B's having success, and I'm not getting compensated for his success by me sending things to him. And that's a one-way street. Like, he doesn't send me anything. This type of stuff happens all the time. And people start getting bitter about these things, and egos get in the way, and it does end up ruining a lot of partnerships. So that happens a lot as well. And especially whenever there's staff involved, because people will say, hey, all the good patients are ending up in Dr. B's column versus Dr. A is not getting his, or they don't schedule the way Dr. A likes it. And there's just so much stuff that happens with those types of things, which brings me to another example of why partnerships sometimes stop working is mainly when you've got people involved. And I've said this in the podcast in the past, the larger the head count, the larger the headaches. If you went from having, say, 8 or 9 employees to having 10 or 20 or 30 even, at some point you got to manage those people. And if you have 2 partners that are managing, say, a team, you're going to have an office manager and administrative staff and head hygienist and all these other head assistants and things like that. If one doctor likes it done in a certain way and the other doctor likes it in a different way, and the office manager kind of resonates with one or the other, or doing it better for one or the other, then that's going to create conflict, because one doctor is going to be like, well, why is this person doing it this way? I don't like it done that way. And this person's because Dr. A said it. Just, all these things happen where it gets so complex so quickly of the interpersonal relationships of running a business and being a medical provider. Things just come up, and it causes conflict, which causes bitterness, which causes partnerships to sometimes fail. So those are very common reasons why partnerships fail. Other reasons why partnerships fail is some of the nastier ones are when one partner's had something happen, whether it be they've had some type of big misfortune, whether it be through an accident or a medical condition or a family incident or some type of a mental issue or something like that. All of these things happen all the time to everyone in the world. Actually, we looked over our clients over the last 12 years, and we looked at all practices that have failed, as in they actually shut their doors, compared to our practices that had other things happen. We actually found that you were more likely to either die or become disabled than you were for your practice to fail. When that happens in a partnership, that obviously is a failure point of a partnership. Now, that doesn't mean the business fails. And generally speaking, when that happens, it hurts the business as well. And so when you're talking about like the creation of a business, you always have to consider risk. And if you have one person there, then there's a huge amount of risk on just that one person. If that person's gone, then the business will end up ending, whether it be sold to another company or something like that. But if there's 2 doctors there, then you have 2 doctors. And if something happens to one, then the other one ends up carrying the bag, so to speak. So that is also a failure point that happens as well. Not a huge percentage of offices have that happen, but it is a thing that happens, and it's something that we got to talk about as an industry. Those are a lot of the more common reasons why partnerships in dentistry fail. And I guess one final reason why partnerships fail is that while both partners started off with the same intentions, at some point, if you're a business and you have any type of growth as a part of the equation, if you have 2 partners and you're like, hey, we each do $1 million a year in revenue, we're each happy with what we're doing, we're just going to keep going with this, then that's fine. But sometimes one of those partners has a different goalpost, like they have a different game they're wanting to play, or maybe they get introduced to that game after the partnership's created. Hey, we're both doing $1 million a year, but one doctor's like, hey, actually, I want to own multiple locations. And so they want to go off and start doing these other things. That can create issues whenever those 2 bandwidths of what they want out of the partnership become different. As well as there's 2 doctors and one of them says, I want to grow a ton. And the other one's like, I don't want to grow much at all. It creates a lot of conflict in terms of the business philosophy and the way in which that practice is ran, because one doctor wants to run it one way and one doctor wants to run it another way. And it creates a lot of tension and conflict whenever that one doctor is trying to grow it, because eventually that doctor is going to start resenting the owner who doesn't want to grow it. And then the opposite side of that, the doctor who doesn't want to grow is going to start resenting the person who is wanting to grow, because a growing business is a changing business. And that means that the person who was happy with how things were may not be happy with all the changes that have to happen in order to be able to make them be able to grow. Thanks for tuning in to the Tooth and Coin podcast. If you found value in today's episode, please share it with a fellow dentist or a practice owner who could benefit. Your word of mouth helps us spread financial wisdom throughout the dental community. So until next time, keep building that thriving practice.